I'm happy to introduce our Dean, Dean Keren Yarhi-Milo, who will give the welcoming remarks this morning. Dean Keren?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good morning, and welcome to the second day of the Credibility of Government Policies, this conference celebrating the distinguished career of our beloved colleague, Guillermo Calvo. It is my pleasure to open the second portion of the conference here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. This is the place where Guillermo has been a professor for over 16 years. We at CIPA are honored to co-sponsor this conference alongside members of the Universidad Torquato di Tella and the financial agencies around the world, all of whom have been shaped by Guillermo's contributions to macroeconomics. To the panelists who have joined us from institutions across the globe, I want to extend my appreciation for your coming to CIPA or speaking yesterday at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in order to share your expertise and celebrate Guillermo's career. Guillermo's work on microeconomics has not only made foundational scholarly contributions to the field, but has also sharpened economic tools to improve real lives. In addition, his skills as an educator has been invaluable to our community. Since 2007, Guillermo has been a professor of economic and international public affairs here at CIPA, and in the past served as the director of our mid-career program in economic policy management, or we call it PEPM. PEPM reflects Guillermo's signature characteristics and carries on his influence still today. It is a special program here at CIPA, and we're very proud of that program. It bridges the gap between economic policies and global development, considering economic theory as it applies to policy issues, and conversely considering case studies in order to identify applicable theory. Under Guillermo's leadership, faculty and students at PEPM engage with urgent financial crisis at the same time as they continue to discover new phenomena that made for smarter policies. Guillermo's greatly expanded the program and its mission. For example, noticing a need for more rigorous policy training around financial and monetary policy, Guillermo in 2016 established a new curricular track at PEPM devoted to central banking and financial markets. Not only has Guillermo bridged the gap within his field, but he has helped close the distance between academics and policymakers, and professors and students. His career in and out of CIPA shows his dedication to integrating the study of economics with its practice in the real world. And this is the mission of CIPA. Indeed, Guillermo advances the core value of CIPA, namely forging global connections between new developments across research fields and among each other by thinking globally. I believe it is what CIPA does best as a public policy school, and Guillermo specifically exemplifies that ideal and leads by example. I want to express my gratitude to him, to the organizers of the conference, and all of you who've come to Columbia, and all of you helped us put this together and celebrate his influential career. I'll now turn the podium to the organizers. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you later today.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here. Andy Neumeyer and I would like to welcome all of you to the Columbia University portion of the Conference on the Credibility of Government Policy, which celebrates the career of Guillermo. It's a pleasure to see here many co-authors, colleagues, students, friends of Guillermo's, and scholars who are working on topics that in macroeconomic theory and monetary theory that Guillermo either discovered or with his analysis took to a whole new level. So again, it's a pleasure to have you here. The first presentation is going to be introduced by Jose Scheinkman. Jose?
Okay, thank you, Martin, for inviting me for this introduction. It is really a great pleasure to participate in this conference to honor my friend and colleague, Guillermo Calvo, arguably the most influential academic economist born in Latin America. We're gathered today for a much-deserved commemoration of his extraordinary pioneering paper on the credibility of government policies. But this year also marks the 40th anniversary of his 1983 article on staggered prices in a utility maximizing framework. The principal mechanism in that paper, which is now known just as the Calvo shock, became the most common way to model nominal rigidity in new Keynesian BSG macroeconomic models. Now, Google Scholar counts in excess of 12,000 sites, which is a truly remarkable number for a theory paper in economics. But I think that, as Martin Uribe alerted me this week when we were talking, this is an underestimate of this paper's influence on economics. So after Martin made that observation, I look at a paper that is still a draft I'm writing with Makoto Nirei from Tokyo. In that paper, we used the term Calvo shock dozens of times, and I looked at the reference. There was no reference to the paper. That's going to be corrected, of course. So the Calvo shock is like the CAPM, the CAPM, something that has become so much a part of our vocabulary that does not need a reference. Now, Chris Sims is, of course, a towering figure in econometrics, macroeconomic, and behavioral economics. Chris has received much well-deserved recognition for his work, and that includes the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Chris' talk is motivated by the current discussion on the cost of deficit financing. Telling Chris, it's very hot in Brazil. I'm sure it's very hot in Argentina, too. And he just told me it's very hot in Japan. Chris goes back to the problem considered by Calvo 78 of the optimal fiscal policy of a government that is able to make policy commitments at an initial date. Guillermo had showed that the optimizing government would choose to implement a non-stationary equilibrium in which the liquidity premium on government debt would stay positive. Now, Chris does many things in this paper, but one of the things he does is show that Guillermo's conclusions are very robust. All you need to assume is that governments cannot become hedge funds and start arbitraging between private and government debt. So, Chris, we're very happy. I'm very happy to see you after all, after being your colleague for so long, to see you here at Columbia.
So I should apologize for the titles. This is not the title that appears on the program. What appears on the program is not actually the title of the paper, but it's all the same subject. So you can, if you're looking on my webpage, it's Optimal Fiscal and Monetary Policy with Distorting Taxes is the paper's official title. So I'm very pleased to be here at this conference. I'm not a former colleague of Guillermo. I'm not a former co-author. I have less of a personal link to him than most of the speakers at this conference. But this paper I'm presenting is a very strong link to Guillermo. I wrote the paper, and it in almost the form that it is in now, and was ready to send it off to a journal, and I thought I should check the literature make sure there's no paper in this general topic area that's come out recently that I haven't seen. So I Googled something like time inconsistency, Friedman rule, or optimal fiscal policy, distorting taxes, or something like that. And the first thing that pops up is this 1978 article by Guillermo. So I read it initially with complete dismay. I thought, everything that's in my paper is already in this old paper of Guillermo's. But slowly I convinced myself that there's a little extra. So I did send it off, adding a reference and a little discussion of how what my paper does is connected with Guillermo's. So his contained the main insights of my paper, and made me appreciate again how influential Calvo has been, how his he was not just influential, he anticipated developments that others stumbled across later, as in my case. So despite the fact that the main insights of my paper were there in the Calvo paper, the paper may still be somewhat interesting. It adds some complications to Guillermo's model that actually make the message of his paper more starkly apparent. It also connects to the paper to a claim by Chari and Kehoe that the Friedman rule, that is the idea that the real return on money should match the public's discount rate, so that individuals see no sacrifice required to acquire money balances. That notion, the Friedman rule, is many people think it must hold in general, and I've often had people cite this Chari and Kehoe paper saying that so long as money and income enter the utility function as a homothetic index, which is actually plausible, that always you will find that optimal, a government will always find it optimal to implement the Friedman rule. And this paper shows, by connecting the Chari and Kehoe assumptions to the assumptions in this model, which are not Guillermo's assumptions, shows that the Chari-Kehoe conclusion does not generally hold. And actually, the more general result is the kind of result that Guillermo found. And then this last point is tongue-in-cheek. The paper uses B rather than M for the government liability, so that we can talk about a government liability with a positive return, but still a liquidity premium. And this connects it to the R less than G literature that Jose mentioned. So the way I started on this paper was reading Blanchard's presidential address in 2019, presidential address to the American Economic Association, in which he explored the implications of persistent low interest rates on government debt. If the real interest rate on government debt remains below the growth rate of the economy, debt can increase steadily at the growth rate of the economy, obviously, with no increase in primary surpluses and no increase in the debt to GDP ratio. And this Blanchard and some people following his contribution have referred to as costless debt. But there is a trade-off. And before I go into this very specific, simple model, I'm going to give you some, I hope, some intuition for why there is always a trade-off between, on the one hand, the idea that we should make the real return on debt match private sector returns, so there is no gap, and this R less than G can't happen. On the other hand, the idea that with R less than G, we have a bottomless source of fiscal financing, and so why shouldn't we always take advantage of that? Keep the real return on debt small, so we have this big fiscal gap that lets us run primary deficits. So here is this formula. It has the real value of debt on the left, and on the right, discounted at the private sector discount rate beta, the primary surplus, revenue minus spending, plus seigniorage. Now, seigniorage term here, there's different ways of defining seigniorage. This is the gap between the agent's discount rate and the return on government debt times the amount of government debt. It represents a kind of tax. It's if this government debt has a zero nominal interest rate, it's just the standard notion of an inflation tax. But when the interest rate is positive, this term is still there, and it's similar to a inflation tax. So you can see that if you take actions that change seigniorage, there has to be some compensating change in revenue minus spending if you're going to keep this identity. Well, it's not an identity. If you keep this equilibrium condition holding. Now, people sometimes get confused by these different possible forward solutions. You can take the government budget constraint and, assuming a constant real rate on government bonds, you can solve it forward to get this other version of the intertemporal, what some people call the intertemporal government budget constraint. And here the seigniorage term has disappeared. We're now discounting at the real rate on government debt, and if that is below beta, then this holds. There's no seigniorage term. But to derive this equation from the government budget constraint, from the period-by-period government budget constraint, you have to invoke the assumption that debt B times e to the minus rho t, where rho is the real rate on government debt, goes to 0. That as t goes to infinity. And that doesn't, in general, hold in an equilibrium model. Can't be connected to the transversality condition of the private agent, whereas the previous one is connected. This is an equilibrium condition. This holds because of transversality, which intuitively is the idea that if debt grows as fast as the discount factor beta, private agents will want to spend down their debt. They'll feel rich, too rich for the level of consumption that they actually have. They'll try to spend more than is feasible. But this version of the government budget constraint assumes b e to the minus rho t equals 0, which does not follow from the transversality condition, and hence is not implied by the is not actually available to us as an equilibrium condition. So Friedman argued that since fiat money can be produced at 0 cost, it must be optimal to expand the amount outstanding until the real return on money and other assets is the same. The prescription is to, quote, saturate the demand for money. And assuming that we have a non-zero nominal interest rate on what we call B doesn't alter Friedman's logic. So Friedman's logic says if R is less than beta, which is generally bigger than G, then you're not optimal. You want to eliminate that gap, whereas the Blanchard argument says, well, that gap is something it gives us free deficits. So one more attempt to provide some intuition. Suppose we have a really super simple model where there's only one asset, one government liability, government issued asset, M, pays 0 interest rate. Tau here, unlike in the rest of the paper, is total revenue. The government budget constraint says that in order to reduce the money stock, M, you have to tax. The If you're going to hand out money to people, that's a subsidy. It shows up in the government budget constraint as deficit. If you want to shrink the money stock, you've got a tax. You've got to pull in some of that money from the private sector. So this is a very simple government budget constraint from a very simple model. Now, in a steady state, m dot over m is likely to match p dot over p. So what this says is, in order to make the real return on real balances is minus p dot over p, minus the inflation rate. So in order to make the real rate of return on money match some positive discount factor beta, you're going to have to make minus p dot over p positive, and you're going to have to make minus m dot over m positive in steady state, and that's going to mean you're going to have to tax. If the only taxes available to you are distorting, then it's not at all clear that you should push all the way to the Friedman rule. Because to push all the way to the Friedman rule, you've got to be constantly shrinking real balances, creating deflation, so there's a positive return on money. There's no way to do that except to tax, and that's distorting. And so it's obvious in this very simple framework that there is a trade-off. And notice that this all depends on our assumption that taxation is distorting. As soon as you say the government can do non-distorting lump sum taxation, lump sum transfers that don't affect the real equilibrium, you go right back to the Friedman rule. It's only because, with the assumption that taxation is distorting, or subsidy, and in this paper anyway, providing subsidies is also distorting, that you get this conclusion that there really is a long-run trade-off. So I'm not going to go through all these papers. The important thing is Calvo there at the top. Also important is Yarhi and Kehoe that made many, that I've had many economists tell me they had the idea that in almost any model, the Friedman rule will be optimal because of Yarhi and Kehoe. These are other papers in this area, and I even have a table here helping you compare them all, but I'm not going to go over that. I will talk about the relation to Yarhi and Kehoe because this gets people hot under the collar. The Yarhi and Kehoe paper, if you haven't read it, go and read it. It's a very interesting paper. It's particularly interesting they emphasize this homotheticity and the intuition that you don't want to tax money because it has the character of an intermediate good. And generally, it's not optimal to tax intermediate goods. And there's something to that intuition, but it actually turns out not to work in this kind of framework unless you have some way to do non-distorting taxation. And what Yarhi and Kehoe do, though they don't emphasize this in the introduction and conclusion, is they assume that at some initial date, sometime zero, the government has the option of buying a lot of private sector securities that thereafter pay a return that can finance the government. So there's no need for any distorting taxes. So they say the only taxes are available that are available in their framework are distorting taxes, but they don't actually have to use any positive amount of distorting taxes in order to support a positive rate of return on government debt. Mike Woodford has a paper that discusses the Friedman rule and shows that if you look across steady states and pick the best steady state, it is quite possible to have the best steady state turn out not to satisfy the Friedman rule. But he doesn't, in that paper, at least the one I cite here, look at a full Ramsey solution, a full dynamic optimization starting from some initial date. So in our slightly different model, maybe not so slightly different, we verify Calvo's conclusion that a benevolent planner constrained to rely on distorting taxes but able to credibly commit to the path of future policy, chooses to have high initial inflation and low initial taxes, and does not converge to a steady state in which the Friedman rule holds. So here's now the model. The layout of it's a pretty simple model. Analyzing it turns out to be not so simple, solving it. But the idea is it has government debt in the budget constraint. There's no capital in the model. The government debt provides some kind of transaction services so that it's return dominated. There is a gap between the real rate of return on money and beta, the discount rate. There's only one input, labor, just one tax, a proportional tax on labor, just one kind of government liability, nominal, duration 0, and it pays some interest rate. Government purchase or expropriation of private sector assets is not feasible. That's an assumption. As soon as you say they can, at some initial date, decide to either expropriate or purchase by issuing suddenly a large amount of money, if you allow them to purchase or expropriate a private sector asset that pays this higher rate of return, that can finance the government debt. We got to rule that out to get this interesting model. So here's the setup. The objective function, the utility function, or the period utility function of the private agent is just log of consumption minus total labor input. We introduced this notation V, which is the ratio of consumption to real debt. If we were talking about money, this would be what's traditionally called consumption velocity. Gamma is a parameter. So the first term in the budget constraint says that when you spend resources on consumption, what you get is reduced by a factor 1 plus gamma V, what you get in terms of consumption, with the gamma V representing the proportion of consumption spending that's devoted to this transactions cost. So it draws in these transactions costs cost real resources. Then the rest of the budget constraint is pretty conventional. There's you can either consume or you can acquire more government debt. That's the B dot over P term. You can work and you get 1 minus tau times the amount of labor you put in as output. And then you also get return RB over P. That's the nominal return on your holdings of government debt. I'm not going to go through these private first order conditions. And these, solving the first order conditions to eliminate Lagrange multipliers, there's not much here that's worth discussing intuitively, except the right-hand side of the second equation. You can see that in steady state, when the left-hand side is 0, this is going to tell you that beta, the discount rate, is R, the nominal return on government debt, minus inflation, P dot over P, plus the liquidity premium, gamma V squared. Gamma V squared is the gap between the real return on money and or debt, government debt, and the discount rate beta. The social resource constraint is that spending on consumption plus an exogenously given, and we'll assume constant government spending requirement G, has to add up to the total amount of production, which is L. And then the government budget constraint is conventional. So I'm not going to go through this. This is just showing that in this setup you get a version of the correctly solved forward intertemporal budget constraint. So now we're going to ask, in this setup, suppose a government comes in at time 0. It doesn't have to pay any attention to commitments that have been made by previous governments about policy, but it can announce policy, which in this model is essentially just the time path of the tax rate, can announce the policy from now to the end of time, is believed by the public to deliver on that plan. Suppose it can do this, what is the optimal thing for it to do? In a considerable part of the related literature, it's assumed that this really is the best policy. But as we'll see in this model, it's best in a discounted sense, but over the long span of time, it leads to terrible outcomes. So the question is, what is the government benevolent government going to optimize? So the first bullet point here raises doubt as to whether it really is a good idea for the government to adopt the objective function of this representative private agent. If the economy really has identical agents, they all face a constant hazard of death, and they discount only because of that, only because they know they're finite-lived. Then you can argue that the planner should care equally about all generations. The planner should be willing to lower the utility of any finite number of generations in order to have an infinite number of future generations that are at the optimum. And so finding the optimal steady state in this model is interesting because it's what an optimizing government that doesn't discount the future would want to do. So at the end, if there's time, I may talk about that kind of equilibrium also. But now we're going to go ahead and ask, suppose we really take seriously this infinitely lived representative agent interpretation of the model, in which case the government planner, the government policymaker, it's not really a planner here, he just picks a tax rate. If the government policymaker adopts the objective function of the representative agent, and this is the assumption that Guillermo made, and discounts at the same rate beta as the private sector, then we get a quite different solution. So it turns out that the private sector's choices, given current and future tax rate, tau, and debt, can be boiled down to a single differential equation that explains V dot as a function of V and tau. The planner's problem then maximizes the agent's objective function, taking this differential equation as the state equation and tau, the tax rate, as the control variable. And the planner with full commitment power can choose the initial value of V freely. That's another way of saying there's a time zero transversality condition, if you're into these models, that sets the Lagrange multiplier on the constraint to zero. And why is that true? It's true because this is a pure flex price model. Once the government announces the time path of taxes from now to the end of time, the private sector has an optimal B, has an optimal real balances. And the price level in this competitive model will jump to make the initial capital B naught, the initial nominal debt, such that B naught over P matches this desired real initial B naught. That's an insight that Calvo's paper had, and we're going on it here also. So in this model, there are two transversality conditions. There's one for the private agents, and actually two for the government. One having to do with the limit as t goes to infinity, and one having to do with this freedom of this initial state to jump. So the government can actually pick any initial V value that it would like. So you can set this up as a Hamiltonian dynamic system and derive the optimal path. And here it is. So what is this? The vertical axis is the tax rate, The horizontal axis is this velocity, the ratio of consumption to real debt. The green line is the locus of all, it can be derived just from the private sector problem. It's the locus of all points on the graph where if you were there, V would stay constant. If we were there and tau were constant, if you were there, V would stay constant. And then by picking tau, you could ask, what's the best point on that green line? And that's the blue triangle. That's the optimal steady state. If you're going to pick among steady states, that's the place you would want to go. The black line is the points on this graph where, in the solution to the government's problem, they would be choosing, the first order conditions say they would be choosing a constant tax rate, tau. So obviously a steady state has to be where both tau and V are constant. It's where these two lines, the green and black lines, cross, which you can see on this plot doesn't exist. They don't meet. In the next plot I'll show you, will show you a slice of this plot that runs from 0 to something like 0.1 or 0.2, and so you can see what happens at the left edge. They do eventually meet, not in finite time, but in a limit. The saddle path is this orange path. This orange path is the path along which the optimizing government would travel. It's neither the green line or the black line. If there's a convergence to a steady state, it has to be to a point at which the orange line, green line, and black line meet. Now, so how did I calculate this? This is a grid. I used the first order conditions to calculate tau dot and V dot at every point on the grid. The red arrows show the direction in which the first order conditions of the model want you to move. And then you just, and then by specifying that I want all the points at which tau dot is nearly 0, all the points where V dot is nearly 0, and the saddle path, I get this plot. Now, this is the same plot, but just a thin slice near the edge. And now we see that the green and black lines do meet. They meet at a positive value of V. That is, in this model, the transactions costs keep going down as you make V smaller and smaller. To fully saturate the demand for money, you'd have to make V 0. That's not actually feasible because it would require infinite amounts of real debt. But you can approach it. You can get arbitrarily close. But the optimal path does not go to V equals 0. It goes to a very small v, meaning in some sense, Friedman's intuition is borne out. You do converge to a very high ratio of debt to consumption. Actually, consumption is going to 0, though, which is not so optimal. Now, why is there no orange line here? There's no orange line here because in this region, the difference between the saddle path and the V dot equals 0 path, the orange line and the green line, is so small you couldn't see it on this graph. It's still true that the saddle path is below the green path, but by a very small amount. It's also true in the previous graph, the size of the arrows indicates how fast you're moving in that direction. Here, all the arrows have the same size because they're all at approximately 0 rate of change. There's very slow movement in this part of the graph. So the saddle path moves along, eventually becomes almost coincident with the V dot equals 0 graph. You're moving extremely slowly here. And one way to see how slowly is that at the point where the orange line ends here, because it's no longer possible to accurately compute the difference between the orange and green at that point, the time from the initial point is the far right end there of the orange line. The time covered by this section of the saddle path is 400 years. So, and the right-hand end is where you start. The fact that you can freely choose the initial V tells you what the initial V is, and it's all the way over here. Interestingly, you can already see there's something strange happening here. The tax rate has gone negative over the first few years, or maybe it's decades, of the optimal plan. The optimal tax rate on labor is negative. You're financing your deficit entirely by the inflation tax. This is all for a setting which G is 0.25. In this model, if we took out the transactions cost, got rid of the distorting taxes, output would be 1, and consumption would be 1 minus G. So that's the scale here. In fact, you can't push there's an upper bound on taxation that's on how much revenue the tax can deliver. So that's giving you the scale. So you see that what's happening here is that the top right graph is the tax rate. It starts out negative. Rather rapidly, remember there's a 400-year scale on this, but rather rapidly the tax rate rises up to around 0.25, which is what you'd expect to be in order of magnitude, since G is 0.25 and output is about 1. But I can tell you that we know analytically, and you can see from those previous graphs, that tau is converging eventually to 1. It's just that for 400 years it doesn't get up above about 0.35. But it has to keep on this optimal path. It keeps on rising. The rate of rise is slower and slower, but it never stops. It's always optimal to promise that taxes will be higher later than they are today on these paths. You can see that consumption, that's the left-hand edge of the second row, starts out at almost 1, which is higher than you would achieve in a steady state with this level of government spending, and then steadily drops down. The utility function goes up and then comes back down. It's in the steady state with the same level of government consumption, the utility, which is the middle graph, would be steadily minus 1.3. Minus 1.3 is about a third of the way down from the top of that U plot. So you can see that over most of the 400-year span, utility is lower than what you could achieve with a simple steady state tax rate. However, for the first 10 years, it's quite a bit higher. Look at the inflation rate. That's the right-hand end of the middle row, pi. It starts out at over 50% as an instantaneous rate, but it's still very high. It drops rapidly and becomes close to 0 after, by the end of a decade or so. But initially, there's a very high inflation. The debt level starts out moderate and rises steadily. And velocity starts out at 5, which means there's a big gap. Gamma v squared is big. Big gap between government and private debt rates, but then drops down. It doesn't go to 0. It converges to a positive but low rate. Here's the first, this is the first 10 years, and you can see on the middle graph for U Minus 1.3 is essentially the bottom, the horizontal axis here. For the first 10 years, utility is higher in log units by 0.2 or so than it is in a steady state commitment. Now, a steady state is also, a steady state, to commit to a steady state, since it's not optimal, the government, there's a constant temptation to deviate from the steady state. It's not that you can go to a steady state and avoid this time inconsistency. But it's a useful contrast to what you get out of this fully optimal Ramsey solution. Let's see if there, I think that's, so why are we getting this result? A very high initial inflation, very low initial taxation, and then a steady rise in taxation. So I still don't have a complete intuition about this, but so long as the liquidity premium on government liabilities shrinks towards zero as debt increases relative to consumption, postponing taxation requires higher taxation later. But, and that's always true, but the need for compensating taxation later grows only at the real rate on government debt. Your obligations are growing at the real rate on government debt, not at beta. So if you're discounting at beta, this looks like a good bargain. By postponing, the present value of that debt burden gets smaller. That's, of course, because the actual value, the time t value, is growing, not shrinking. It's only the present value that's shrinking. The time t value is getting bigger, and since the taxes are distorting, the taxes are getting, the amount of distortion is growing the longer you postpone. But the initial postponement doesn't make the distortion go up very fast, and so there's always a temptation to say, let's tax later, and because discounting at the rate beta, the present value of taxation is going down. So in a constant tau equilibrium, which is these steady states on the green line, it's always at the margin improving, welfare improving, to tax less today and somewhat more later. But tau can't go above 1. If tau hits 1 in this economy, people are getting nothing for their work and they'll not work. So tau has to stay below 1, but it has to always increase. And you end up with this equilibrium in which it goes very slowly towards 1. So there's always an optimal tau knot for a policymaker who sees himself as starting over with no obligation to validate the expectations formed from earlier policies. So there's always a temptation to restart by jumping to that tau knot. It's completely implausible that this policy would actually be implemented, because by the time you get to tau equal 0.99, people are so miserable with tau equal 0.99, consumption is going to zero, debt is going to zero, but the ratio isn't going to zero. It's a terrible equilibrium in which it's still optimal to promise. It's still optimal as of time zero to announce that by the time you get t equal 2,000 years from now, that you will be taxing more later than now. But the path is so miserable by that point that the temptation to deviate is arbitrarily big. Utility is going to minus infinity on this path. So the temptation to say, well, I didn't really mean it, and to go back to a steady state, or just say, well, we're going back to tau naught and starting over, would be very great. This is different from the classic classroom examples of time inconsistency in macroeconomic policy. A standard way to set that up is to say there's a Phillips curve. The Phillips curve isn't a real trade-off because only surprise inflation actually lowers unemployment. If a government who wants to lower unemployment will be tempted to create a surprise inflation and lower unemployment. But that temptation, if the government commits and says we're not going to do that, then every period there's a temptation to deviate, but the amount of the temptation is stationary. What you get for deviating stays the same on the path you've committed to. In this example, the time inconsistency gets worse and worse and worse over time. So it becomes very implausible that you would stick to it forever. So I did look at a certain form of limited commitment. This is a commitment because the reason I looked at this form is not that it's particularly plausible, but that I can use the same differential equations. So I had almost all the code to do it. You can say, suppose office makers come in to office and they know they have T years in office. At the end of that time, a new government comes in that has no commitment to any promises you've made. So you know that you're going to be replaced by a new government that will treat your cap T as their time zero. I thought maybe that by removing the option to maintain the inflation tax base by promising very high taxes far in the future, if you have high taxes far in the future, the amount of debt outstanding, the real value amount of debt outstanding today is high. That gives you a good tax base for your inflation tax. That's why high taxes in the future go with high exploitation of the inflation tax. So if your term in office is going to end after T years, you have fewer years to promise higher taxation. I thought that might make the outcome better, but it doesn't. So here's the way you solve it is just to recognize that if all these planners are the same, they're all going to choose the same B naught. They have no commitments to the past. This is different from some more complicated models of limited commitment over a finite span, in that there is no state variable that gets transmitted from the initial policymaker to the next policymaker, because the next policymaker can cause a price jump that goes right to his optimal B naught. So every policymaker is going to choose the same B naught. Arbitrage in private markets mean that there can't be a jump, since it's perfectly anticipated that the policymakers are going to change at time T. There can't be a jump in the price level at time T. That means B naught and BT have to be the same. That is, you have to end up at the same real value of government debt at the end of your term in office that you chose at the beginning, because you know the next guy is going to choose that, and markets won't let you have a price jump at that point. So each policy problem is well defined now. You know what the beginning and terminal, you choose the initial B naught, you treat the final B naught as unchangeable and given to you, so there's no time T transversality condition. And you end up with B star, the next period's initial B matching B naught. And that's a relatively easily solved problem. And this is the set of plots you get. Maybe the two most important ones are the pie chart, which is the right-hand most in the middle row. The initial value of inflation is 0.8. That's higher than the initial value of inflation in the model with unlimited horizon. So you get even more inflation, not less. The utility, which you remember over the first 10 years in the full commitment infinite horizon solution, utility stayed well above steady state utility for the same G over the whole first 10 years. Here, the steady state level of utility is just below the top of the graph. You only stay above that steady state level of utility for about 2 years, and then utility drops drastically. So over the average utility over these 10-year spans is quite a bit worse than you could achieve if you could commit to an optimal constant tax rate. So you can, limited commitment doesn't make things better. You still get this temptation to rely a lot on the inflation tax at the beginning and postpone taxation and have taxation rising steadily over time. So I have some tables of what happens in the optimal steady state. Maybe I'll show you quickly. There's too many numbers in these tables. The realistic row in each table is the 0.01. That's the second row. These are steady state values of various variables in the model under assumption of constant tau and a fixed g of 0. It's assumed that the nominal rate on government debt is 2%, which is also the discount rate beta. That means that the inflation tax is the P dot over P. The inflation tax rate is the P dot over P column in these tables. This is with G equals 0. And so the interesting thing here is that with G equals 0, so there is no need to tax in order to finance spending. You still tax in order to keep P dot over P small and keep transactions costs down. So the difference, the P dot over P is quite small at 0.0012, 12 basis points. That's the steady state optimal gap between rho and beta, between the real return on government debt. It's very small. You go pretty close to the Friedman rule, even though it's not optimal to go all the way to the Friedman rule. And you derive a very small proportion of your total tax revenues from the inflation tax. This is with the middle row shows you the steady state values that I was comparing to when we looked at the full dynamic solution. And you see the minus 1.3 there in the U column for the gamma equals 0.01. The reason I say 0.01 is, quote, realistic is that it makes the debt to consumption ratio close to 1, which is where the US economy is now. And then this is G equals 0.8. So this is a very high level of government spending. Consumption has to be pushed down to 0.2 or so. And then you do start getting negative primary surpluses. You are exploiting the inflation tax to allow you to reduce the tax rate because the tax rates have to be so high that they are very distorting. So the conclusion is, I didn't show you, but it is in fact true that this model is set up in such a way that it satisfies the homotheticity assumptions of Chari and Kehoe. And so the first conclusion is that thinking about fiscal monetary policy interactions as analogous to choice of excise tax rates in a static framework is misleading. Sudden shifts in demand for liquidity. I didn't show you that, but if you compare rows of those steady state values, you can see that modest changes in G or in gamma, which is the demand for liquidity, can result in very large changes, very large jumps in the initial price level. And I think that's the kind of thing we actually have seen recently in the US. That is the 2008-9 great financial crisis created a sudden jump in demand for liquidity that came both from people realizing how fragile the financial system was and from policy interventions that required more robust balance sheets. And So apparently modest changes in desired balance sheets can result in very large pressures on the price level if there is not offsetting policy reactions. And the last one, which is related to discussion of the R less than G literature, is that high debt to income ratios in these models are sustained by high taxes and low inflation. If you run a lot of nominal deficits, you might think that, well, if you look at the numerical results, they seem to say really high levels of debt to GDP ratios are good. But you don't get to those, in this model with nominal debt, you don't get to the high ratios of real debt to GDP by running big deficits. If you run big nominal deficits, you create high inflation and you shrink the amount of real debt. To get the amount of real debt high, you have to have high taxes and low inflation in these models. So I wanted to leave a few. I know that there's some people in the audience who've heard this before. I'm hoping they will have had time to digest it and ask penetrating questions, so I'll stop.
Digested it, Chris. But, you know, like when you showed, I was just trying to think when you showed this equation at the very beginning, and then you showed again in the middle of the presentation. It's kind of like, you know, I thought that you explained that it was sort of central, that you integrate with respect to the discount factor. The other terms are kind of like, you know, sort of revenue, seniorage, and expenditures, and that's kind of the present value that's considered. This is one of the key ingredients, and the explanation of this is beta, no? Discount rate, I guess, here. Okay, so I was trying to figure out, not successfully here, but whether this is exactly like what, or some other people that know better this literature, what they kind of, that look like an implementability constraint. Because it would be something like the budget constraint agent of the government, Barbara's law, kind of the same. I mean, with feasibility will be the same. And it will be, but I'll shout. The discounting will be with the preferences, and then the other one will be in utils. And it will make the comparison with Cherry and Kehoe more transparent, because that's the way they write it down. It's not, you know, some other people that know better about this area that are here, sorry, they may, I'm looking at you, they may actually, sort of, but you know what I mean? Like, it really looks like their implementability constraint.
Yeah, I maybe should just take out this section with the intertemporal budget constraints, because it's true that it's just in a very simple model, which is not this one, it would be that there is a single constant discount rate, beta, that private agents use to discount future returns. And that's not true in this model. In this model, all along the path, C dot over C, the rate of consumption, change of consumption is non-zero. That means the real rate is moving around, both the real rate on money and the real rate at which private agents discount. So if I'm going to put in a forward solved equation from this model, you're right, I should just not use the constant rho or constant beta versions of that. That was just to try to give people an intuition for why there has to be a trade-off. There is this implicit asset of the government, which is the discounted present value of seigniorage. So when you fiddle with, if you make changes in policy that change the real rate of return on government debt, you are doing things to fiscal balance. You will require some kind of offset in taxation or expenditures. But it's true that those equations, if you try to enter the paper through those equations, it will be confusing.
That was a penetrating question, Fernando. So, any other ones? Back there. Hi.
My question is, I'm running What? So I'm saying like in the U.S. assemble. So
Does
what should the U.S. government do if you are the leader of the countries?
This
Thank
is
you.
asking me to take this model and turn it into a policy recommendation, which I would hesitate directly to do. But this model does justify the notion that high debt-to-income ratios, if the private sector seems to be willing to pay a premium to hold government debt, and then high debt-to-income ratios that are supported by correspondingly high levels of taxation are not necessarily bad. They represent there's a trade-off there. If you want, it might be good, if your tax levels are really high, you might like to reduce them, and the way to reduce them is to get the debt down. That will get the taxes down in the long run. But we know from simple models like Barrow's optimal fiscal model that you don't want to quickly reduce debt. If all the taxes available are distorting, quick reductions in debt require a lot of distortion, so you'd like to do it slowly. And in this model, which is, it doesn't have any foreign sector, it doesn't have any capital, so you don't want to turn it into a direct policy recommendation.
I think that's it. Thank you.